The attack on the World Trade Center is now part of American history. And although time has made these images familiar, the shock of the event itself will never be forgotten.
It was too cataclysmic to be real. It seemed almost like the end of the world.
But unknown to everyone watching, the horror was soon to get even worse. As the buildings burnt, the fires began a hidden process of destruction, and a new, more terrible phase of the tragedy began.
Ultimately, the fire ate away the heart of the building, and eventually ate away enough so the buildings collapsed.
Although the attack was the fault of terrorists, questions have been raised about whether the enormous loss of life could have been caused by deadly structural failures in the buildings themselves.
I think the building was a death trap for a lot of reasons.
As the city recovers from this awful event, with plans for a new skyscraper to rise from the ashes, there are some who worry that it could happen again.
Have we learned from the deadly mistakes of 9/11? I'm very sorry to say we certainly have not learned enough.
Could history repeat itself? If ever there was a single place that defines a turning point in modern times, this is it, Ground Zero. Now just a massive hole in the earth, the excavation of the site is all but complete. Thousands of visitors a year are drawn to stare at the empty sky where the towers once stood. Aside from a fence, a list of the dead, and a few information boards, there is literally nothing to look at. But still they come. The importance of these 16 acres of Lower Manhattan cannot be overstated. They are so packed with pain and symbolism that any attempt to rebuild here will always be mired in controversy.
It's more than contentious. It's quite bitterly disputed. I mean, everybody feels they have a stake in it. Everybody feels they have an interest in it. And they're right. In a sense, everyone does have an interest in it. But it has become a nightmare of conflicting wishes and views and expectations and obligations.
Nevertheless, the plan is to rebuild and redevelop this site on a vast scale. Powerful New York figures Larry Silverstein, Mayor Michael Bloomberg, and Governor George Pataki launched a global competition, and in 2003 the grand plan was unveiled. Its main feature was a new skyscraper, the gigantic Freedom Tower, 1,776 feet tall. As the mayor pointed out, the key idea was to prove that terrorists would never win.
This is a very, very important building. We will build it in honor of the memories of the heroes we lost. We will build it as a tribute to the courage and the strength of New Yorkers. And we will build it to show the world that freedom will always triumph over terror, and that we will face the 21st century and beyond with tremendous confidence.
But there are some who worry that by building a new tower, Ground Zero will become a target once more. Sally Regenhard's son, Christian, was one of the 343 firefighters who lost their lives on 9/11. Since that day, she has devoted her life to campaigning for safer skyscrapers in America.
I'm very concerned that whatever is built there is going to be the biggest terrorist target in the world. And I'm wondering why it's necessary to rebuild something like that, you know, when we could build a memorial and a center that certainly would not be a terrorist target.
The New York Police Department had similar concerns, saying it could be too vulnerable to terrorist attack. Just 6 months before construction was due to begin, the design was ruled out.
Well, the original Freedom Tower design had the tower right near a major street where a truck bomb could easily park on the curb and detonate and cause major, major damage to the building.
Professor Eve Hinman is one of the world's top experts in protecting buildings from terrorist attack.
I would want the whole building to be underground. That would be the safest place from my perspective, or to build it like a bunker. But we have to recognize that explosion effects, of course, isn't going to govern the design of this building. This building is there to talk about how strong we are and how proud we are and that we are a free country.
The redesign was completed in only 8 weeks, and in June 2005, a new proposal was unveiled, and more speeches were made.
Its construction will climax the greatest comeback in the history of our city. And for generations to come, it will be a powerful beacon of freedom to people around the world.
The new design is far more conventional, sitting atop a 200-foot-high cube of reinforced concrete.
The new building will be the safest building in the world, no question. And while we certainly want beautiful buildings, and we will have beautiful buildings, nothing will be more important than the safety of the people of New York.
The building will now be an average of 95 feet from the nearest road. But is it safe enough?
The reality is nobody really knows. Yes, you know that it takes a certain amount of distance and a certain amount of solidity to protect from a certain size bomb. But who's to say they won't come up with a bigger bomb? Who's to say they won't come up with some other idea altogether that has nothing to do with bombs?
Faced with this uncertainty, it's vitally important that lessons are learned from 9/11. So that should the unthinkable happen again, New Yorkers will not face another horrifying total building collapse. When these buildings were designed, they too were claimed to be among the safest and strongest in the world. But events proved otherwise. The structural engineer who built them is Leslie Robertson.
The responsibility for arriving, if you will, at the ultimate strength of the tower was mine. And the fact that they didn't stand longer could be laid at my feet. Do I feel guilty about it, about the fact that they collapsed? The circumstances on the 11th of September were outside of that which we considered in the design. Today, if I knew then what I know now, they would have stood longer, of course.
Investigations into the tragedy have questioned whether the Twin Towers' design contributed to the terrible loss of life on that day. With a new building on the drawing board, the story of how the original towers were built and why they fell is more important today than ever before. The 1960s, when it was a neglected, run-down neighborhood. Then as now, cutting-edge technology was heralded as a solution to a problem. What to do with 16 acres of Lower Manhattan?
It was a classic American response to a problem, which is hit it right down the middle with as much firepower as you can give it. It was just whammo, the two biggest skyscrapers in the world, clearing away blocks of Lower Manhattan. Well, that was going to fix everything, right?
The architect was Minoru Yamasaki, a Japanese-American who died in 1986. His first challenge was to work out a way around the one thing holding back the height of skyscrapers: the elevators. The problem was that with a building 110 stories tall, so much of the ground floor is full of the elevators needed to service the upper floors that the building becomes uneconomic. The way the issue was solved was to treat each third of the skyscraper as a separate 40-story building, so that fewer elevator shafts would be needed. The pattern was repeated 3 times, and the whole system was linked together with express elevators that were the only ones that would go the whole height of the building.
If you went to an upper floor of the World Trade Center, you didn't get in the elevator at the ground floor and go to your floor. You got into a big, giant elevator to what was called a sky lobby, and there you switched for a local elevator to your individual floor. That's what they did, and that's how the buildings happened.
Yamasaki's innovation meant that it was now viable to construct towers so tall they would face a second engineering challenge: the wind that can sometimes reach hurricane force in New York City. Constructing huge buildings that could deal with these gales would need yet more innovation.
Most skyscrapers are built on steel or concrete frames, which is a grid of columns and beams that goes all the way through the building. The World Trade Center was different. It was what engineers call a tube structure. It was a very, very strong mesh of steel that surrounded the exterior.
The way in which these walls were built was equally ingenious. 3 30-foot-long columns were welded together off-site to make a relatively lightweight, yet rigid prefabricated panel. This was then hoisted up to join thousands of similar pieces, forming a massively strong wall of steel. In the middle stood a steel core, which would contain all the stairwells and the elevators, giving the towers one of their major selling points: large open floor spaces of nearly an acre each.
Tenants like open space. It's flexible. It allows them to have big open rooms if they want, or to put temporary partitions anywhere they please.
The construction progressed at an amazing rate: 3 floors every 2 weeks. Steel arrived from all over America and beyond, arriving just in time to be hoisted to its new home in the sky. The end result was a building of extraordinary structural efficiency and unprecedented scale. Hundreds of acres of office space stacked one upon the other, reaching almost a quarter of a mile above New York. Instantly, the Twin Towers became internationally famous, a symbol of America itself, and a popular tourist attraction.
It's hard to be down when you're up on top of the world. So come on up, take a good look around, have some fun at the top of the world.
The observation deck at the top of the World Trade Center. If you think the view from inside is spectacular, wait till you get outside to the roof. It's breathtaking.
Have some fun at the top of the world.
Tragically, the towers also drew the attention of terrorists. And on February the 26th, 1993, a hired van packed with hydrogen canisters and the equivalent of half a ton of TNT was driven into an underground parking garage beneath the complex. Although there was no vehicle access actually inside the towers themselves, the terrorists got as close as they could, parking the van 2 floors down, 6 feet from the subterranean south wall of the North Tower. At 18 minutes past 12, the bomb exploded. Six people were killed and 1,042 injured in what was at the time the biggest terrorist attack ever carried out on American soil. The intention had been to demolish the base of the North Tower and cause it to fall into the south. The terrorists had not reckoned with the extraordinary strength of this tube of steel.
The bomb was a serious bomb, but in terms of a building of the scale of the World Trade Center, it was not a significant event in terms of the tower. Now, outside of the tower, it was another matter completely.
The bomb failed to demolish the towers because it exploded outside the perimeter wall, the blast merely bouncing off and shattering several floors of the parking garage and a machinery space below that. The next time the terrorists attacked, the outcome would be very different, because 7 years later, they finally managed to penetrate the tower's defenses. Began at 8:46 a.m. British-born naval architect George Slay was on the 91st floor of the North Tower.
I was on the phone, I heard a roar, looked out the window and saw this passenger jet coming towards the building. It was only about 2 or 3 plane lengths away from me at that point, and I didn't really have time to react. It was just, I saw it and then it was into the building.
George's office was just below the point at which nearly 200 tons of Boeing 767 had struck the tower.
Our offices are between the 2 arrowheads, and my office was particularly to the first 3 windows to the right of this arrowhead, in this area here. It doesn't get much closer than that.
At 2 minutes past 9, as people watched in horror, the second plane hit. Among those watching were staff from Leslie Robertson Associates, the structural engineers who had built the towers.
Well, after the first tower was hit, all of us were gathered around the windows on the north side looking towards the North Tower. People thought it was a movie, but, you know, it was unreal. We were so stunned.
In the months and years since that appalling day, the complete set of plans and drawings that are kept in this office had been under intense scrutiny. Although some people were lucky, these plans graphically illustrate why many in the building would not escape.
These are the architectural drawings of the World Trade Center North Tower, Tower A. And this is the 94th floor, which is very close to the floors of impact on the North Tower. So the plane came in from the north, which is this way, so broadside onto the core. The core is from here to here, and from there to there.
If an outline of the aircraft is superimposed on the plans, the true scale of the impact becomes all too clear. The central core could offer little protection, since its walls are made of a lightweight board called sheetrock. Within seconds of the impact, the stairwells and elevators were rendered useless.
With the layout of the stairs, which are here and here, don't think that anybody above these floors would have been able to make it out.
When we first went into the stairwell, the people who investigated the stairwells looked up, and you could see that the stairwells were blocked above us. There didn't seem to be, and there's a lot of debris there, and there was nobody coming down from floors above us.
In the North Tower, 1,360 people died above the point of impact. Critics speculate as to why no one escaped through the damaged zone.
It's really tragic, you know, when somebody loses a colleague, a husband, a son, or whatever, to explain to them that they died because of defects that we knew about before the incident.
Jake Pauls is an expert on escape from high-rise buildings. He studied the towers after the bomb in '93 and believes that the stairwell design was misconceived.
One thing we see is the stairs are very tightly clustered together relative, for example, to the diagonal dimension.
There's a traditional rule that says that the stairs should be at least half or a third of the diagonal apart. And we can see here they're actually much too close. This was a poor design in terms of the layout of the stairs because there wasn't enough redundancy. For example, so if an incident affects one stair or blocks one stair, it's very likely to affect the other stairs.
Message received September 11th at 8:59 a.m.
Hey, Beverly, this is Sean. In case you get this message, there's been an explosion in World Trade 1. It's the other building. It looks like a plane struck it. It's on fire at about the 90th floor, and it's horrible.
Sean Eckert worked on the 98th floor of the South Tower. Before the second plane struck, he had already begun to leave, but was told to go back to his desk.
When the plane hit the first building, the manager of his floor began an immediate evacuation. They headed for what I've since learned would have been Staircase C. And at some point in that process, an announcement came telling them that the building was secure and that they should go back to their offices.
No one knew a second plane was about to hit, and when it did, one chance to escape had already been missed. Half an hour later, Beverly spoke to her husband on the phone.
And he said, well, we're trapped. We tried to go down. We got as far as, I think he said 79, and he said that, it couldn't get down any farther. So we tried to go up, and he said the doors are locked.
Many believed they could be rescued from above by helicopter, but it appears heavy smoke and obstructions on the roof made it impossible.
Sometime after the 93 bombings, they had cluttered the rooftops with all kinds of equipments and barriers purposely to prevent helicopters from landing on the buildings. And they never told the people who worked there.
Only 18 people survived from above the impact zone. Sean Eckert died along with 600 others in the South Tower. Although experts now think that the escape routes were badly compromised, unfortunately, there was worse, far worse to come. Plans for a new tower at Ground Zero get underway. The story of how the original towers fell takes on a new relevance. The effect of the massive fires on the steel buildings is particularly important because fires are a universal threat, even if they are seldom seen on this terrifying scale.
In the weeks after 9/11, it was obvious to me, and I think others, that there was a really desperate need to study this as thoroughly as possible because we were going to learn things from this.
Both buildings were severely damaged, and in very different ways. In the North Tower, the plane had punched its way through approximately 36 of the exterior columns, but it was the steel frame of the core that absorbed the brunt of the energy from the attack. The South Tower was even worse off, since it had been struck lower down and across one corner. With more weight above the damaged area, it was under much more stress. And because the damage was off-center, the upper section was trying to lean to one side. The fact that they could stand at all is a testament to the extraordinary strength of the tube of steel. But what was the cause of the unprecedented failure? How did these fires, which were not hot enough to melt steel, overcome the vast, solidly built structures? Professor Hassan Astaneh examined the wreckage of the towers shortly after they fell. Here, amongst the thousands of tons of twisted steel that were stacked in a New Jersey scrapyard, he studied the columns to try and find out what the collapse mechanism could have been. There were several clues that immediately pointed to a very specific and unusual scenario.
What you see here is actually very critical, very, very important. Perhaps this is the most important piece I have found so far. This piece comes from most likely Tower 2, where the plane went in and exploded. This is the inside face-off back columns. So plane went in, exploded right here, and the explosion hit this surface. What you see here is, first of all, a bend that is due to explosion, but more importantly, this is a signature of explosion here. This has happened due to explosive material hitting this column and making that bulge. So this is the floor where explosion happened. And the windows are blown away, everything is burned, even fireproofing on this floor is burned and glazed to the steel.
The fireproofing in the World Trade Center was sprayed on, a dry, fragile material made of mineral fibers. Designed to protect the high-strength steel from heat in the event of fire, it played a crucial role in the durability of the two vast structures. But there is evidence that, at least in some areas of the towers, the fireproofing failed to do its job.
This piece, as you can see, has been burned. You can see the smoke and the fire effect on it. You can see some fireproofing, but really not much of it is left. So you can see that when the building was burning, there was no fireproofing left.
Any lack of fireproofing means that the steel near the floors of impact would have been softened and weakened by the fire. It now seems that this may have had an unpredictable, disastrous effect on a crucial part of the building structure, the support for the massive open-plan floors. At MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Professor Eduardo Kausel carried out research into how the collapse might have happened.
It is always easy to play the general after the war. However, it is important to understand why it is that the structures fell. And if the structures did have an Achilles heel, I believe that this Achilles heel were the floors.
The floor system was unusual for a high-rise building. Instead of the thick steel beams that are normally used, the floors were supported with lightweight structures called trusses. A steel deck was placed over them to form prefabricated panels, which were then hoisted into position. They were fastened at each end to brackets welded to the wall, and once in place, each floor was covered with a 4-inch layer of concrete. This system was one of the reasons the towers could be built so quickly, since each floor was largely pre-assembled down on the ground. But Professor Kausel believes that such lightweight trusses can be very susceptible to fire. Damage even a small section, and the whole system fails.
Here we have a model of the floor system with the floors and the beams, the trusses. This system is very strong, is very light, very stiff, but it is also very susceptible to fire. And therefore it has to be fireproofed very well and appropriately. To demonstrate this, I have here a similar floor system that has been fireproofed everywhere except at these two locations here. And we will see what effect these elements can have on the behavior of the structure.
First, the load on the floor is simulated with metal weights, and then the system is heated up with a gas burner. Almost immediately, the unprotected elements fail, compromising the strength of the entire unit.
This demonstrates that the structure is only as strong as the weakest link. This element that fails, even if it is only slightly exposed, is the one that determines how strong the structure will be.
Even though most of the truss remains as strong as ever, the failed section pulls inwards, putting enormous loads on the connections at the end, which, if not properly protected, would also be weakened by the fire. So what happened to the fireproofing? Why, as appears, was it so ineffectual? The National Institute of Science and Technology spent $16 million on an analysis of the collapse. It suggests that most of the fireproofing was dislodged by the impact of the planes. But there is another possible explanation. One that, if correct, could mean the towers should have stood for longer than they did. The fireproofing that was so vital to the World Trade Center had a checkered history. In 1995, a court case took place about asbestos in the sprayed-on material, and consultant architect Roger Morse was asked to examine it. What he found greatly disturbed him.
The fireproofing on the tenant floors, on the trusses, was missing in many locations. It was thin in virtually all locations.
These photographs taken in the mid-1990s show the state of the fire protection in at least some parts of the building. Few places show a 1 1/2 inch thick coating, the amount required to adequately safeguard the steel.
You can see that the fireproofing is missing from the diagonal. This is the diagonal that's going to the end point where the truss is sitting on the outside column.
Although he only examined the lower floors of the North Tower, Roger Morse's photos show that at the time, many of the vital connections on which the floors depended were almost bare.
I don't know what happened. The applicator didn't install it properly. It wasn't inspected properly. Somehow or another, the fireproofing guy was allowed to take a pass on this, which is really quite an outrageous thing when you consider the importance of what's going on.
Those responsible for fireproofing in the World Trade Center have stated that its maintenance was an ongoing headache, but that the buildings were safe. The floor trusses at the impact point of the North Tower had been refurbished in the last few years of the building's life, but only one of the floors struck by the aircraft in the South Tower had been retreated prior to September the 11th, 2001. They also claimed that the impacts were so severe and the damage so great that the collapse was inevitable. This view is disputed by Roger Morse.
The fireproofing had been in good condition. If it had been installed properly and had been maintained properly, then the buildings certainly would have survived longer and may even have survived altogether. May never have collapsed.
Whatever the true performance of the fireproofing, the last phase of the destruction was now underway. With the floors sagging and pulling inwards, and possibly falling away altogether, the columns would now be vulnerable to buckling and breaking, triggering the progressive collapse of the tube of steel. Again, the principle is easy to demonstrate.
Here we have two models. These two structures are identical except that this one here is missing an intermediate floor. And we shall see what effect this floor has on the way that the structures carry weights. I'm going to be loading first the structure on this side. The important thing to keep in mind is that these loads are transferred through the columns to the table, and that this intermediate floor carries none of this load. All it does, this floor, is it ties the columns together, and it provides stability to the columns.
The model on the left is easily able to take a very large load.
And I could add more weight like this one here. Perfectly stable. Let's begin removing weights and adding them onto the structure on the other side.
If the one with the missing floor is tried, it cannot support nearly as much. Without the stabilizing effect of the floor, its columns twist and buckle, and it collapses. The South Tower burned for 56 minutes before it fell. its floor trusses probably unable to brace the vertical columns and keep them from buckling under the immense gravitational load. While Lower Manhattan was smothered in a filthy, choking dust, the fire continued to eat away at the strength of the North Tower. It stood for longer because it had been hit straight on, and so could better redistribute the loads. It also had less weight above the point of impact. But the fire would seek out the weakest part nevertheless. And this time, the core columns would give way first. Once the top of the building had fallen just the height of a single story, its vast momentum smashed each floor in turn until all 500,000 tons of steel hit the ground at 120 miles per hour. That rarest and most devastating of phenomena, a total progressive structural failure, had claimed the two largest buildings in New York, and with it, the lives of thousands of innocent people. It's up to the authorities to convince everyone that such a catastrophe could never befall the building that is about to rise on the same site, the 1,776-foot-tall Freedom Tower. Since 9/11, building codes, the standards by which buildings must be constructed, have slowly begun to change. Stairwells must be wider. Trusses are currently banned in new skyscraper design, at least in New York, and fireproofing regulations have been tightened. The architects of the Freedom Tower, Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, are one of the world's largest architecture firms. The building's designer is Dan Childs. Neither he nor a representative of his firm were able to give an interview for this program. The man tasked with keeping the entire project on track is one of Governor Pataki's top advisors, John P. Cahill.
On September 11th, we were attacked because what we stand for as Americans, our way of life, the financial capital of the world. It is extraordinarily important for New Yorkers, and I think as Americans, that we reclaim that ground, that we have a fitting memorial for those that died and sacrificed that day, but we also have a statement of freedom, of what this country stands for.
Although little has been made public of the detailed design, the planners say they have incorporated as many safety features as possible into the tower. They also state it will easily exceed the building codes.
And the base will be reinforced to protect it against any possible blast at the bottom of the building. It will have staircases that are 20% larger than what's been originally designed, required by the code to allow for access and egress by firefighters and rescue workers while people also look to egress the building. The core will be reinforced by 2 to 3 feet of concrete, and within that core you'll have the safety infrastructure for the building, whether it be the sprinklers, whether it be the elevators, the staircases will all be protected by 2 to 3 feet of reinforced concrete. There is no question that the Freedom Tower will be the safest building built in the world.
With so many security features implemented, the new building will certainly be much safer than the old ones were, which is reassuring to observers.
There's an old saying that he who ignores history is condemned to repeat it. And I think as far as the lessons of 9/11 are concerned, the developers, the development community, specifically the building owners, I think have embraced that to some extent, because they have actually made changes beyond what our code requirements call for. I think we need a lot more, I really do, but I think the owners have seen the light here and realized that they have to change building designs to anticipate, the threats of the 21st century.
Glenn Corbett is a professor of fire science in New York City. Although he applauds the improvements, he worries that when it comes to fire, very tall buildings need careful consideration.
When you build a very tall high-rise building, you're putting the occupants a very long way away from the firefighters. And so you have to give them the ability to ride out that fire, to ride out that disaster until the firefighters can get up there and either evacuate them and deal with the situation.
In the event of a fire, caused by terrorist action or not, the fireproofing will be critically important, a fact not lost on the builders of the new tower.
Fireproofing used in the Freedom Towers is 5 times required by the New York City Building Code. Nothing will be left untouched with respect to the safety and security designs of this building.
But there is a fact about the site owners that worries critics.
Federal buildings, as well as the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, are totally exempt from local building and fire codes. So the World Trade Center site is totally immune from local regulations. We have to trust them.
This was also the case at the time of construction of the original Twin Towers. Although the Port Authority have stated that the new tower will exceed building and fire codes, the exemption means the building is unlikely to face the same scrutiny applied to other buildings in New York.
The Port Authority will retain the immunities that it had in its first World Trade Center buildings, and that is an abomination.
The Port Authority state that while they are legally exempt from the codes, they are bound to comply anyway, due to a memorandum of understanding signed with the New York City Building Department in 1993. Others claim the agreement has no significant legal force. But one last issue remains. Codes or no codes, does New York really need another tower?
There will always be people who will say, don't do it. And certainly the tragedy that we lived through in 2001 gives you a strong reason to be afraid to do it. But I think we've learned enough about technology, and I think the standards are much, much higher from a safety standpoint and a structural standpoint. Is it the right symbol? I think going back up into the sky has always been a sort of noble quest. And I think there's a way to do it that doesn't put people at unnecessary risk and will give them again an object of pride rather than fear.